She didn't wake up one morning empty. She didn't suddenly stop caring. And she didn't leave because love disappeared. What disappeared was her tolerance. For a long time, she endured quietly. She explained herself gently. She waited, hoped, adjusted, and compromised, believing that love meant patience without limits. But something inside her was keeping score. Not of mistakes, but of patterns. Not of words, but of how often her needs were dismissed. When she finally walked away, it shocked people. She changed, they said. But the truth is simpler and far more uncomfortable. She didn't lose feelings. She lost the ability to keep betraying herself. Tolerance is not infinite, no matter how deeply someone loves. It feels endless in the beginning, because love floods the mind with meaning and hope. At first, tolerance disguises itself as patience, compassion, and understanding. She tells herself that this is what love requires. That to love is to endure, to adjust, to forgive quickly, and forget completely. She believes that if she just explains a little better, waits a little longer, bends a little more, things will eventually settle into harmony. What she doesn't realize is that tolerance is not a moral virtue without cost. It is a psychological reservoir, and every unmet need draws from it quietly. In the early days, small disappointments barely register. A forgotten promise is brushed aside. A careless comment is reframed as stress or exhaustion. She becomes skilled at interpretation, translating neglect into excuses so the connection can survive. The human psyche is remarkably creative when it is trying to preserve attachment. It would rather distort reality than face the pain of loss. And so she tolerates not because she is weak, but because she hopes. Hope keeps tolerance alive longer than it should. But the nervous system remembers even when the mind forgives. Each time she feels dismissed, unheard, or emotionally alone, something inside her tightens. She may not speak it aloud, but her body records the experience. The chest grows heavy during conversations that lead nowhere. The stomach knots before difficult moments that have become predictable. Over time, tolerance begins to drain, not dramatically, but steadily, like water leaking from a cracked vessel. There is no single moment where it disappears. There is only accumulation. What makes this depletion so invisible is that she continues to function. She laughs, she shows up, she supports. From the outside, nothing seems wrong. But internally, a quiet reckoning is taking place. She starts to notice that the effort is uneven, that she is the one carrying emotional awareness, initiating repair, smoothing tension. This realization doesn't arrive as anger at first, it arrives as fatigue. A deep, bone-level tiredness that sleep does not fix. This is the moment tolerance begins to transform into endurance, and endurance is never sustainable. Psychologically, repeated emotional strain triggers the same systems as physical stress. The mind goes into adaptation mode. She becomes less reactive, not because she cares less, but because reacting costs too much. Silence starts to feel safer than expression. Distance feels calmer than engagement. This is often misunderstood as emotional withdrawal, but it is actually conservation. When tolerance runs low, the psyche prioritizes survival over connection. She may still love deeply. Love does not disappear just because tolerance is fading. Love is emotional attachment, memory, longing, and meaning. Tolerance is the ability to continue accepting pain without breaking. When tolerance diminishes, it is not love that has failed. It is the body refusing further harm. This is why she can care and still walk away. Why she can miss someone and yet choose distance. The heart and the psyche do not always move at the same speed. There comes a point when the smallest incident feels disproportionately heavy. Not because it is large, but because it is familiar. It carries the weight of everything that came before it. This is often when others say, "Why now?" But now is simply when the internal account reaches zero. Tolerance has been spent on explanations that led nowhere, on promises that repeated themselves without change, on hope that was never met with equal effort. What emerges in place of tolerance is clarity, and clarity can feel cold to those who benefited from her endurance. She stops negotiating her worth, stops asking to be treated better, stops explaining what has already been explained too many times. This is not cruelty, it is psychological maturity. The self finally recognizes its own limits. In this stage, she may grieve, not just the relationship, but the version of herself who tried so hard to hold it together. There is sadness in realizing how much she endured in the name of love. But there is also relief. Relief in no longer betraying her own signals. Relief in listening to the quiet voice that had been whispering for a long time that something was wrong. Tolerance ending is not a failure of character. It is an act of self-recognition. It is the moment the psyche says, this is as far as I can go without losing myself. And once that line is crossed, returning becomes impossible, not because she doesn't feel, but because she finally does. This is how tolerance truly ends. Not in anger, not in drama, but in a calm inner decision. A decision shaped by countless small moments, stored in the body, processed in silence. And when she steps back, it is not to punish anyone, but to protect the part of herself that can no longer afford to endure what love was never meant to require. Repeated disrespect does not arrive as a single unmistakable wound. It comes quietly, almost politely, woven into everyday moments that seem too small to confront. A dismissive tone here, a broken promise there, a joke that cuts just deep enough to linger. At first, she tells herself it is nothing serious. She believes intention matters more than impact, and she chooses to see the best rather than the truth. The mind, when bonded, is generous to a fault. It prefers harmony over honesty, even when honesty is what the soul requires. Each instance of disrespect asks a silent question of the inner self. Will you protect me, or will you explain this away? In the beginning, she explains. She contextualizes. She empathizes. She assumes responsibility for emotional clarity that is not hers alone to carry. This is not foolishness, it is attachment. The psyche is wired to preserve connection, especially when love or belonging feels at stake. But what is explained away does not disappear. It is stored not as a memory, but as a sensation. The body learns before the mind does. The shoulders tense during familiar conversations. The breath shortens when certain topics arise. There is a subtle vigilance that was not there before. This is the soul taking notes. Repeated disrespect slowly reshapes the internal landscape, teaching her what to expect and what to brace for. Over time, she no longer hopes to be understood. He hopes to avoid being diminished. Disrespect, when repeated, becomes instruction. It teaches her where she stands without ever stating it clearly. When her feelings are dismissed often enough, she learns they are inconvenient. When her boundaries are crossed without repair, she learns they are optional. When her pain is minimized, she learns that comfort will not come from the place she once trusted. The lesson is not delivered in words, but in patterns, and patterns speak more truthfully than promises ever could. What makes this process so painful is that the soul resists the lesson for as long as possible. There is a deep reluctance to accept that someone who matters can also be the source of harm. So she waits for change. She communicates more carefully. She lowers expectations. She adapts. Adaptation, however, has a cost. Every time she silences her reaction, the self recedes slightly. She becomes quieter, not because she has nothing to say, but because saying it has proven useless. Psychologically, this creates a split. On one side is the part of her that still loves, remembers, and hopes. On the other is the part that feels unsafe, unseen, and slowly erased. Living in this tension requires constant energy, and energy is finite. The longer the disrespect continues, the more the soul begins to prioritize preservation over connection. This is not bitterness forming. It is wisdom awakening. There is a moment often unnoticed by others when something shifts. She stops asking for basic care, stops correcting behavior that should have been obvious, stops believing that effort will be met with effort. This moment is mistaken for indifference, but it is actually recognition. Recognition that she has been learning all along, that the lesson has already been taught, repeated enough times to be undeniable. The soul learns not through lectures but through experience. And repeated disrespect is a harsh teacher. It teaches her that love without regard is not love at all, that closeness without safety is not intimacy, that endurance without dignity is self-abandonment. These realizations do not harden her, they clarify her. They sharpen her sense of self and redefine what she will no longer accept. As the lesson integrates, her behavior changes naturally. She becomes less reactive, not out of apathy, but out of understanding. She no longer tries to convince someone of her worth. Worth does not require persuasion. She begins to step back, creating space where there was once overextension. This space is not emptiness, it is breathing room. It allows the self to return. Those who benefited from her tolerance may feel confused by this change. They may say she has changed, that she is distant or cold. What they fail to see is that she has stopped absorbing what was slowly harming her. The soul, once it understands a lesson deeply enough, cannot pretend it never learned it. Awareness is irreversible. Repeated disrespect ultimately teaches her the most important truth, that self-respect is not something granted by others but something practiced internally. And once this truth is embodied, she cannot unlearn it. She moves forward not with anger, but with a quiet resolve born from experience. The lesson has been costly, but it has also been transformative. What remains is not resentment, but a deeper alignment with herself. An inner steadiness that no longer depends on being treated well to know she deserves to be. Emotional labor often begins invisibly, wrapped in care and attentiveness, mistaken for love itself. At first it feels natural to notice the unspoken, to anticipate moods, to soften words so they land gently. She listens closely, remembers details, adjusts her timing and tone, and holds space not only for her own feelings but for another's inner weather as well. In the beginning, this effort feels meaningful. It creates closeness. It gives her a sense of purpose within the bond. She tells herself, this is what intimacy looks like. Being attuned, being thoughtful, being the one who understands. But emotional labor is work, even when it is done with tenderness. It requires energy, presence, and constant self-regulation. When it is shared, it deepens connection. When it is one-sided, it quietly drains the self. She becomes the translator of emotions, the mediator of tension, the caretaker of the relationship's emotional balance. If something feels off, she is the one who notices. If something breaks, she is the one who repairs. Over time, this role solidifies without being discussed. It is simply expected. What makes this exhaustion so difficult to name is that nothing looks obviously wrong. There may be affection, shared history, even moments of joy. Yet beneath it all, she's carrying the emotional weight alone. She thinks ahead so conflict can be avoided. She chooses her words carefully so feelings aren't hurt. She absorbs discomfort so peace can be maintained. Slowly, her own inner experience becomes secondary. There is no space left to rest because rest would mean letting things fall apart. The psyche can sustain this imbalance for a while, especially when love is involved. Hope extends endurance. She believes that if she just keeps showing up emotionally, the other person will eventually meet her there. But hope, when unreciprocated, turns heavy. The nervous system begins to show signs of strain. She feels tired even after sleep. Conversations feel effortful. Emotional connection starts to feel like obligation rather than nourishment. This is not because she has become unloving, but because she has been overgiving. When emotional labor is one-sided, the self starts to disappear in subtle ways. She stops expressing certain needs because it feels easier not to. She minimizes her reactions to avoid conflict. She becomes skilled at carrying disappointment quietly. Over time, this self-silencing creates distance from her own inner truth. The relationship may continue, but her presence within it becomes thinner, less embodied. She is there, but not fully alive. Psychologically, this creates burnout, not resentment. Burnout is quiet. It does not shout or accuse. It shows up as numbness, detachment, and a growing desire for solitude. This is often misunderstood. Others may think she no longer cares, when in fact she has cared for too long without support. Emotional exhaustion is the body's way of signaling that something essential has been neglected. Reciprocity. There is a moment when she notices she is always the one reaching out, checking in, initiating difficult conversations, or offering reassurance. This realization is painful because it reveals an imbalance she can no longer ignore. Love, she understands now, cannot survive on empathy from one side alone. Connection requires mutual presence. Without it, emotional labor becomes emotional survival. As this awareness deepens, her behavior changes. She begins to pull back, not to punish, but to breathe. She allows silence where she once filled the space. She stops managing emotions that are not hers to manage. This can feel frightening at first, as if she is letting go of control. But what she is really doing is returning responsibility to where it belongs. This withdrawal is not a lack of love. It is a reclaiming of energy. The psyche cannot endlessly pour without replenishment. When she stops overfunctioning emotionally, she starts to feel again her own needs, her own limits, her own worth. This is where clarity replaces confusion. She sees that effort without reciprocity is not devotion, it is depletion. Those around her may notice the shift and misinterpret it. They may say she has changed or become distant. What they do not see is the exhaustion that came before the distance. They did not feel the constant vigilance, the unspoken pressure to keep everything emotionally afloat. Her quiet is not indifference, it is recovery. Emotional labor, when shared, strengthens bonds. When carried alone, it erodes the self. And the moment she recognizes this truth, she begins to choose differently, not from bitterness, but from a deep, embodied understanding that love should feel like mutual presence, not perpetual effort. In honoring this, she does not lose connection. She restores herself. The breaking point is rarely loud. It does not announce itself with shouting, tears, or final words meant to wound. It arrives quietly, almost respectfully, after everything that could be said has already been said too many times. Long before the ending becomes visible, an internal shift has taken place. She has reached the place where effort no longer feels hopeful, only heavy. This is the kind of ending most people do not notice until it is already complete. At first she fought for understanding. She explained her feelings carefully, softened her tone, and chose her words with intention. She believed that clarity would lead to change, that being honest would bring closeness. Each conversation carried the unspoken hope that this time it would be different. But when explanations are met with the same responses, hope slowly loses its grip. The psyche begins to learn that speaking does not lead to being heard. What replaces hope is not anger, but observation. She starts to watch rather than plead. She notices patterns instead of promises. This shift is subtle but profound. It marks the moment she stops trying to convince someone of her reality and starts trusting her own perception. Silence begins to feel safer than repetition, not because she has nothing to say, but because she has learned that saying it changes nothing. The body often recognizes the breaking point before the mind does. Conversations that once sparked anxiety now provoke emptiness. Situations that once hurt deeply now feel distant. This emotional numbing is not coldness, it is protection. The nervous system cannot remain in a state of constant activation without consequences. When the threat of disappointment becomes familiar, the system adapts by withdrawing energy. This is how the self preserves what remains. To those on the outside, nothing appears wrong. She still shows up. She still responds. She still smiles when required. But inside, something essential has detached. She is no longer emotionally invested in outcomes. She stops imagining future repairs. The internal dialogue quiets. This calm is often mistaken for peace, but it is closer to acceptance. Acceptance that the relationship, dynamic, or situation will not become what she hoped it would be. The most misunderstood part of this process is its stillness. People expect the breaking point to be dramatic, to come with ultimatums and visible collapse. But drama belongs to earlier stages, when there is still something to fight for. When the breaking point arrives, the fight is already over. What remains is clarity. She no longer needs to prove pain. Pain has already taught its lesson. There is a moment when she stops seeking reassurance, stops checking messages with anticipation, stops replaying conversations in her mind. This is not because she is healed, but because she is disengaged. The emotional cord has loosened. The psyche has quietly decided that continued investment is no longer safe. This decision is not made out of spite, but out of self-preservation. When she eventually steps away, others may feel blindsided. They may say there was no warning, no sign, no final argument. But the warning was the repetition. The sign was the countless times she tried to connect and was met with the same distance. The final argument already happened internally, long before any external move was made. By the time she leaves, she is not angry, she is resolved. This resolution is often mistaken for indifference. In truth, indifference is what follows grief, not what precedes it. She has already mourned the version of the connection she wanted. She has already felt the loss while still present. That is why Levi Ng looks calm. The storm passed long ago, unseen. The silence of the breaking point is not weakness. It is the culmination of awareness. It is what happens when the psyche integrates all previous experiences into a single, undeniable truth. Once that truth is accepted, there is nothing left to argue against. The inner conflict dissolves, replaced by a steady resolve. What emerges from this quiet ending is not bitterness, but alignment. She begins to trust herself again. She listens to the signals she once ignored. She honors the limits she once crossed for the sake of love or belonging. The absence of drama does not mean the absence of pain. It means pain has already done its work. The breaking point, silent and unseen, is where the self returns. It is not the collapse of connection, but the restoration of inner integrity. And once that integrity is reclaimed, there is no need for noise. The decision has already been made within, gently, firmly, and for the first time, without doubt. Losing tolerance is often misunderstood as becoming cold, distant, or unloving. But in truth, it is the quiet beginning of self-respect. It does not happen suddenly, and it does not happen without pain. It begins after long periods of endurance, After countless moments of choosing peace over truth and connection over self, for a long time she believed that tolerance was a sign of strength, that enduring discomfort was proof of commitment, and that loving deeply meant accepting what hurt inside. She did not realize that tolerance, when stretched too far, slowly teaches the self to disappear. At first, she tolerates because she hopes. Hope convinces her that things will improve, that effort will be met with effort, that patience will be rewarded. She explains herself carefully, gives second and third chances, and lowers expectations so disappointment hurts less. Each compromise feels small, almost reasonable, but the psyche does not measure damage by size alone. It measures it by frequency. What is tolerated repeatedly becomes internalized as normal, and what becomes normal begins to shape identity. Over time, something within her starts to resist. Not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently. A quiet discomfort arises whenever she agrees to something that betrays her needs. The body responds before the mind fully understands. There is a tightening in the chest when she stays silent, a heaviness when she apologizes for wanting basic consideration. These sensations are signals, reminders that the self has limits, even when the heart wishes otherwise. Losing tolerance is not an act of rebellion against others, it is a return to honesty with oneself. It is the moment she stops explaining away her own pain. She begins to see that love should not require self-erasure, that understanding someone else's wounds does not obligate her to accept harm. This clarity can feel frightening at first, because it threatens familiar patterns. She may fear being seen as difficult, selfish, or ungrateful. But beneath the fear is relief. Relief in finally acknowledging what has been true for a long time. As tolerance fades, self-respect takes its place gradually. It shows up as boundaries that no longer feel negotiable, as silence where she once over-explained, as a refusal to chase clarity from those who have consistently avoided providing it. This shift is often misinterpreted by others. They may accuse her of changing, of becoming distant, of no longer trying. What they fail to see is that she has stopped abandoning herself to maintain connection. Psychologically, self-respect is not built through affirmation alone. It is built through action. Each time she chooses not to tolerate what diminishes her, she reinforces a new internal standard. The nervous system relaxes because it no longer has to brace for repeated harm. There is a growing sense of stability, even if uncertainty remains. This is the paradox of self-respect. It may cost relationships, but it restores inner coherence. There is grief in this process. She mourns the version of herself who believed endurance was love. She mourns the future she imagined if only she tried harder. Letting go of tolerance means letting go of illusion, and illusions can be comforting. But grief is not regression. It is integration. It allows the self to absorb the lesson without becoming hardened by it. As self-respect strengthens, her standards become clearer, not harsher. She no longer seeks intensity without safety, or closeness without consistency. She values peace not because she is afraid of conflict, but because she understands the cost of chaos. This does not make her less loving, it makes her more discerning. Love, when filtered through self-respect, becomes intentional rather than desperate. She may look back and wonder why she tolerated so much for so long. But judgment has no place here. Tolerance was not a mistake. It was part of her learning. The soul often has to experience its own limits before it understands them. What matters is not how long it took, but that she listened when the message became clear. Losing tolerance is the birth of self-respect because it marks the moment she chooses alignment over approval. She no longer measures her worth by how much she can endure, but by how faithfully she can honor herself. This choice does not make life easier, but it makes it truer. And in that truth, she stands more fully in herself. No longer shrinking to fit, no longer bending to belong, but rooted in the quiet strength of knowing what she deserves and refusing to accept less. She didn't lose feelings. They're still there, deeper, wiser, more selective. What she lost was tolerance for being unheard, undervalued, and emotionally alone in a relationship meant to be shared. And when she walked away, it wasn't punishment, it was alignment. Because the moment a woman stops tolerating what hurts her is the moment she begins honoring who she is, and that is not loss, that is awakening.